morning, everyone. When we started thinking about how to organize, cloud computing into 15 minutes, my wife happened to be planning an elementary school lesson on the classic question words, and it seemed like a good way to organize it. So in a very short amount of time, I'm going to try to cover the who, what, where, why, and how of cloud computing as it exists at Rutgers University. So we'll start clearly with who. It's easy. There currently is a cloud team that is located within the enterprise infrastructure area of the Office of Information Technology. The team is a team of two. It comprises of myself, Andrew Page, as well as Jawad, who works as kind of a full-time cloud admin on us. This work was all organized under an IT Leadership Council Strategy Committee for Enterprise Cloud Computing. Bill Lansbury was the sponsor of that committee. Doug McCrae chaired it when it existed, and Al Vasquez was the project manager for that effort. And the members that assisted in developing this program are listed below. The EI Cloud team is responsible for what we kind of call core enterprise cloud infrastructure. We work with VPN tunnels and billing and that sort of that base foundation that you build on. We're happy to work with various groups that are working with the cloud. So we'll look at your workloads, talk about what tools and services might be available to help you get going. We're pretty easily reachable. There's a number of email addresses on our website for different purposes. There's web forms to make various types of requests. And we monitor the cloud support channel on Slack for that more informal type of question as opposed to an actual incident or request. The other who for cloud is that the vendors we work with all do make very large investments in helping Rutgers and all of their customers use the cloud. They understand that's the core of their business. So they will work with you on products selection. A lot of our vendors have a tremendous breadth of options available, and they'll help you go through what one might work. They'll take a look at what computing your individual group is doing and make suggestions for what might be easy things to move or good first kind of targets. They offer a lot of free training, both kind of locally on campus sometimes. They'll bring it in if there's a need identified. There are summits in the area. Prior to the virus, it was very convenient to be this close to New York City. One of the one of the upsides of the changes with COVID is all three vendors have made their conferences both available online and now free. So they are now open to the world. Anyone can sign up to attend the sessions. They've also spread it out a little bit. So it used to be you'd go for 4 crazy intensive days and you get kind of saturated. Now they tend to run over 3 weeks, and you can kind of take an hour out of a couple different days in order to gather some more information. So what does cloud computing mean at Rutgers? So the definition we've always used is it's IT services delivered over the internet. In a traditional IT model, you would have a local data center or a machine room. You might lease data center space. You'd have dedicated telecommunication lines going there. You'd have your own local LAN. People would be coming into your office building. What cloud computing did is said, that's great, but now everyone's doing the same sort of things, the same sort of ways. It's tremendously replicated. It doesn't scale well. So let's take a few very large companies, 3 in the case of who Rutgers partners with, and they're going to build this out at massive scale, not terabytes, but exabytes. They're going to build data centers with, not, hey, we have a backup generator, or we have redundant backup generators. We have a farm of backup generators. These providers make heavy use of automation. Again, Amazon came out of their retail business. Google's obviously been an internet company forever. They need automation in order to survive. So if you're going to offer services to millions of customers, spinning up tens of millions of virtual machines a day, there's no human pushing buttons. So because these platforms have invested so heavily in automation, it makes it a lot easier for the Rutgers staff to take advantage of that automation. You don't have to build it all from scratch. A lot of the work's already done. What I know that surprises people is that the resources are shared. Everyone kind of instinctively knows that. You're not getting your own personal server. You're getting a virtual machine across a large cluster. But the nature of that means these vendors have invested a lot of energy in isolation, more than even the services that Rutgers itself offers would. So whereas, in Rutgers, we own everything. If user A uses a little more CPU than they need to, and it kind of comes out of user B, that's all for the benefit of the university. There's no real major concerns there. In the cloud, you pretty much are going to get exactly what you pay for. Sometimes there's well-defined bursting policies, so you can go a little bit above the baseline, but they're going to make really sure that customer A does not impact customer B. And as you look to deploy services, it's good something that you have to keep in mind. Probably the biggest thing, which is a blessing of this, is everything's available effectively instantly. So once you have a cloud account set up, you need a virtual machine, you need a database, you need a new component. You're typically going to have that component in seconds to minutes. It's not, there's no procurement. You're not waiting for shipping. You don't care that component's out of stock. You can't get a webcam because they're out of stock at BB&H. You pretty much grab what you need when you need it, which requires a change in thinking, in that you don't want to plan ahead in exactly the same way. Budget-wise, you want to forecast your growth, but you never want to buy something in the cloud you're not actively going to use. Just get what you need when you need it. Rutgers Cloud is really focused on the three largest cloud vendors in America, in the US. Amazon Web Services is the largest and the original cloud vendor that most people are familiar with. They have the most service offerings out of all three. I think last year I looked at it, they released over 1,900 new services as part of their offering. It's almost impossible to keep up with. For example, some of the more recent ones they've done, this year they're offering quantum computing. So you can either simulate it or actually use some of their first generation hardware around that. They deploy blockchain if those things are needed for you. They're pretty consistently deploying specialized databases, such as databases that are optimized for data over time. We're currently working with one of the Rutgers units that does weather research with this. They also have taken two of the most popular open source database engines, MySQL and Postgres, and deployed a service called Azure, which allows those popular database engines to be completely API compatible on the front side of it, but on the back side, they've completely rewritten the storage component so that they work natively with cloud storage and therefore get much better performance at much lower cost. Azure is sort of our second provider. They're obviously what Office 365 is built on top of. Typically, we see a lot of departments using this that are big Microsoft shops. Using Azure does allow you to leverage the university's existing software agreements, which can be a substantial cost savings. Azure is also very well known for their business intelligence capabilities. Google is obviously Google. Everyone's heard of them. Google Cloud Platform is, again, built on that same platform they've built their internet business on. Google's invented many of the cloud techniques. So there's, you can use containers, Kubernetes. These are all technologies that came out of Google. They're also very heavily focused on AI. The TensorFlow open source framework, which has almost revolutionized machine learning, it came out of Google and was released for absolutely free. Sometimes Google will have lower costs, especially if you can do, so their preemption models are very much easier. But like all cloud, you have to be very close attention to your workloads and check each one individually. So where can you find out more about cloud computing if you're kind of curious? Clearly, we have a website, cloud.rutgers.edu. Contains a bunch of request forms, information to links to things we find useful. It has contacts for our team, as well as email lists to reach our cloud vendors. There's basically 4 email lists. One will kind of contact everyone at Rutgers who's going to be able to support you. The other 3 include that first list, but also include the contacts at each vendor. So there's an AWS cloud team or an Azure cloud team email that are listed on that website. We did this because we're constantly seeing in, it's now Slack, it used to be on the IT mailing list, who's our current Dell rep, who's this rep, because it changes. And so the cloud team, keeps those mailing lists up to date for you. So if you want to reach out to the vendor and want us to know that you're doing it, it's a very simple way to do that without having, to track the churn in the environment. The only thing we do ask is, think about which group you're mailing. If you want to ask the question, hey, which is the best cloud provider? That probably shouldn't go to the vendors. Keep that to the Rutgers internal list. But if you're already working with one of them and have a question on a new feature or service, it's a convenience feature. So why would you want to consider cloud computing? Why is this potentially exciting to you? I'm going to cover 2 use cases, both of which have occurred in the last 6 months. The first involves a VPN for the help desk. As everyone's aware, last spring, Rutgers made an incredibly rapid transition to working remote as well as teaching remote. The main VPN service that was going to allow people in this environment to access on-campus resources is supported by the OIT Help Desk. And most of the tooling needed to support the VPN, you have to be on the VPN to access those tools. So there was a concern about making sure that if the VPN became saturated, staff would be able to actually effectively support it. We very quickly saw that AWS offered services in this area. We stood up a directory proxy in AWS so that we could take advantage of Rutgers authentication. That service uses university passwords, and we went ahead and used certificates as the second authentication factor, just to keep an MFA on that. It worked out fairly quick. It was built out in a couple of hours, spread over 2 days while we were waiting for some things to happen. It's paid for only what you use. So there's no need to forecast, am I going to have 20 users using this? Am I going to have 200 users using this? It's simply paid by the minute every time someone logs in. It's a fairly low charge. Typically for the help desk, we're averaging $30 to $40 a month in VPN Connect charges, as well as there's an overhead for the directory proxy. It's a Microsoft box, so it's a little bit more expensive. But, quick example, at the time we did this, you couldn't buy VPN hardware. Every company around the world wanted this stuff. The stocks went to zero. This is something we were able to deploy in 2 days with no capital expenditure. And now that the VPN is, Rutgers has been being able to upgrade its VPN service, we can just sunset this, again, with no loss of capital or sunk cost. Similarly, towards the end of the summer, it became clear that foreign students were not going to travel to the United States at this point. And Rutgers, as most of you know, has a large number of foreign students. During some of the testing, accessing these from, in particular this case, China, they found that our existing learning management systems were rather sensitive to latency. A lot of these websites make a lot of round trips back and forth to assemble the content, and the user experience wasn't what Rutgers wanted it to be. We worked with RU Global to use a program called AppStream, and this stood up a bunch of web browsers running out of Amazon in Virginia. Now, the latency between Virginia and Rutgers is actually quite good. Rutgers has a private line down there to Amazon, primarily so the students in the dorm used to be able to watch videos. And that private line allows us to, allow the web page to render quite quickly. And the normal application virtualization technologies, similar to a Citrix type solution, gave a much better user experience because those technologies are optimized for latency. This was a solution that was proposed. It was prototyped and shown in a day and was deployed in less than 4 days to support a population of up to 400 users. So, 2 quick examples of where the cloud allowed us to do something that we really felt we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So last but not least, how do you get started? First, there's a bunch of questions you're going to kind of want to think about before you go ahead and request a cloud environment for yourself to use. We're going to need to know which platform you want to use. Are you kind of requesting a sandbox account to do some early prototyping of public data? Or do you want to go ahead and ask for what we would call a production account, even though many production accounts do include pre-production type servers? Do you need access to Rutgers' private IP space? Are you accessing items that are restricted to campus only and we need to set up VPN tunnels? Useful to know ahead of time. Are there any special security requirements around your data? Rutgers has both policy as well as many grants have special rules that have to be followed before we move things around. And we're going to need to know, how do you want to pay for it? Cloud is paid for centrally, but it is billed back to the units based on the actual costs involved. Kind of a quick little flow chart about how this would work. Typically, you fill out a request on the web. We're going to contact you to ask some questions and help you through that previous slide worth of data. If you're going to request a non-sandbox account, you're going to go through a security review process with our risk office. If it's a sandbox account, you just need to agree to the limitations on that are listed on that web form. Again, we have to decide if you're using RUNet, we'll go ahead and do a normal network allocation, just like you would normally ask the NOC for, assign some IP space to you, get it set up in DNS. If you don't need that, then you'll go ahead and just use the regular 192.168 block in the cloud and can do that all by yourself. Once all that data is gathered and collected back, the cloud team will provision an account for you. And the word account here means a container for your cloud objects. It's not a personal account. We'll also then grant access to your personal account to that container, And once we've done that, you are the full administrative controller of that particular cloud container, and can then add your own new users, allocate VMs, do whatever you need in order to conduct your actual business. As I kind of mentioned with that security piece, the cloud doesn't get you out of having to pay attention to security and data governance. So this is part of the intake process. We do actually go back and ask you questions, periodically to make sure nothing has changed. We collect, contact information. So if there are issues, you know who to talk to. But this is sort of, the normal part of Rutgers. Many of you have done a third-party security review as part of purchasing a service. This is basically the same kind of process. Once you have that cloud account, we do have to worry about billing. The OIT Finance Office is primarily responsible about that, and the Enterprise Infrastructure Cloud team helps with gathering, the data and making sense of your bills. Currently, we pay for the AWS and Google bill monthly, and we pay for Azure sort of quarterly. Azure kind of just sends a bill whenever they feel like it. OIT will collect money from the individual departments 4 times a year. You can always view your charges with the cloud portals. You'll see exactly close to what you're being charged. There are rounding errors. A lot of these things cost thousands of a cent, and as they get added across accounts, it might be a penny or two off, but it's within a few cents, so that's usually close enough for budget purposes. You can also set alarms if you're concerned that your charges might exceed limits. So if you expect your cloud bill to be $200 a month, you can set an alarm. If it's more than $220, email me right away so I know something's not going on. Both the Rutgers Cloud team and vendors are happy to work with you to try to manage these costs, point out ways of doing things cheaper, use pre-purchasing agreements if they make sense. There's a number of ways to manage costs in the cloud. So again, thank you for listening. Good luck on your cloud journey. If this is something that you think would help you or your unit, OIT is always happy to step in and get started with you.
Thank you, Andy. Wow, lightning talks, cloud computing. Who knew techies and meteorologists had so much in common? We are right on time, so we have a few minutes for some questions. The first one comes in from Dave Motovidlak. Where do you find out about those online free conferences that you mentioned when you first started?
So, we tend to post them in the Slack channel. We certainly can put them up on our website. If you have an account with one of the cloud providers, you're probably already getting them in your email as well. But yeah, we can certainly, the Google one will be in the spring, and AWS is actually running in a few weeks. So we'll make sure those get up on both Slack and our website shortly.
Great, thanks, Andy. Another one from an anonymous attendee. They ask, do we have Google or AWS cloud computing certifications and courses available to our students?
So there are, I didn't cover that based on this audience. There is, for each of the vendors, there are extensive programs around education where we can give credits for students, professors can collect, get free resources to teach courses. They're not focused on certification perhaps, but there are, in terms of the university's instructional mission, that's an entirely different lightning talk. The programs are fairly broad. In terms of, for IT staff, OIT does have, does make use of some training partners, and even a couple of our, other groups have bought into that, to do certifications. There are now starting to be certification options also pop up on lynda.com, which the university has a license for.
Thanks, Andy. Real quick from Dave again, are all the billing and dashboard functions available for sandbox accounts?
So sure, there's no difference from the vendor between a sandbox and a regular account. It's just, it just has to do with how it's managed through the risk office at Rutgers. So yeah, all the same functions are there. A couple of the cloud vendors, there's some little weird permission things that can creep up. So, if you ever find out that it's not working, tell us, and it's usually trivial to fix.
Great, thanks. Here's one from Victor Odovenko. How many groups at RU are using cloud resources, and what is the most popular at Rutgers?
So I think we have about 50 or 60 total accounts split across the 3. There's a pretty even split between AWS and Google and Azure. So Azure's, I think there's probably 30 or 40 in each of those, and Azure is probably running 12 to 15 right now. Those numbers will be in the OIT annual report when it's published shortly. So I just didn't happen to have them perfectly memorized. But yeah, they're definitely in there every year.
All right, thanks, Andy. The next one is from, hopefully I don't mispronounce his name, Jagar Patel. Is there any way to predict approximate recurring cost for cloud services?
Very common question we answer all the time. Typically, we sit down with a team that wants to evaluate a workload, and we'll prepare a formal budget. There's a bunch of questions we have to ask. And a couple times at Rutgers, it's hard to answer those in terms of, how many users, some of the bandwidth type questions are a little trickier. But we have good estimates and, typically come within about 5% of what the cost actually turns out to be.
Okay, great. This will be the last question, Andy. We're running out of time. I know this is there's a lot of detail that goes into this, but from Faizan Ahmed, he asked, for budgeting purpose, can you provide a rough cost comparison for an application hosted by OIT at the local cloud, ASB1 data center, versus something that's hosted on a public cloud, AWS or Microsoft?
So the short version is absolutely not. We can do it for an individual workload. So the individual workload, but this answer is highly dependent on the nature of the service. We all the time do this work and are happy to do it on a specific use case. What we generally find is if your workload is very compute driven, often the on-prem can end up being a lower cost. If your work is very storage driven, often there's potential savings in the cloud in those use cases. Those are very broad generalizations, and it really involves looking at the individual workloads, which is something our team is always happy to help you with.
All right, one real more quick one here from Bobby Perez. Are there any benefits or advantages to go with Azure over AWS or Google Cloud, given the 365 Rutgers subscription?
The biggest advantage for Azure, given Office 365, is twofold. One, authentication is built in, which is kind of convenient. It uses the same authentication as Office 365. So, from my perspective, setup's a little tiny bit easier. The big advantage is licensing. Now, this is a complex topic. You need to work with the cloud team. You need to work with Susan. Don't take it from this quick answer. But right now, we get a lot more benefit out of the university's investment in site licensing in Azure than we do in the other platforms. If most of us are used to paying academic rates on Microsoft software. In Amazon, you typically will pay a commercial rate, and your jaw might hit the floor the first time you see those numbers.